This is great. Thank you for all the talks. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here and give you an idea of how we use, GPT in the classroom, an actual use case that was quite successful. So, in short, during lecture, we prompted all students to ask questions, and we're able to sort of address them all at once. Of course, using GPT. Now, first, let's talk about student questions, why we should care. Of course, they're important, but let's say a few more things about that. So asking your students to articulate their thoughts in the form of questions is a fundamental part of learning. I mean, without doing that, there's no robust, knowledge that's acquired. So it's game over without that. So any way that we have to encourage students to ask questions, we have to do that. So in the context of lectures, of course, there's a lot of benefits to students asking questions, but let me highlight a few here. Of course, it increases engagement, obviously. One is peer learning, is that when students hear questions from someone else, it turns out that misconceptions and difficulties are very common among students. For those of us who have taught for a while, you notice that, right? So when a student hears a question from someone else, they learn from that. On the other hand, students think quite differently about the material. So another very useful tool for them to learn is to hear other people's perspectives, which they can do through questions, hearing other people's questions. Now, from a faculty standpoint, questions are just equally important. Equally important. I'll try to make an important point here. So why? Because extracting the information from student questions, right? It's extracting their thinking. And without having, this information, there's no way to produce effective learning content. Like, for example, I'll try to keep picking the simplest example I can think of is clicker questions. If they don't use them a lot, okay? So clicker questions, there's no way to produce very effective ones unless you have information about student thinking. In the same way as I feel like I'm getting a bit on my soapbox here, but in the same way that my daughter right now, one of my daughter is learning about long division, and of course I'm a content expert in doing long division. But trust me that if I was asked to develop learning activities for these little kids, it would be terrible. However, if I was given a list of student questions where I could extract their thinking, then I have a much better shot at producing good learning content. So for those of us who have been teaching courses, which is the norm, by the way, let's say for 3 years, right, one year after the other, we all know that by the third year, we become far more effective. And that's not because we've learned a lot of physics along the way. It's because we've gained an understanding of student thinking. That's why. And what's pretty sad, no, insane, is that this information, this very expensive information is lost, right? When a new instructor comes into the course. So it would be nice if there was a way to keep that information. And what I'm showing you today is a means to do that. So I'm working myself into a frenzy here. So yeah, student questions are important. And but unfortunately, we only get a few of them during lectures, right? For many reasons. So in a large survey in 4 courses, students were asked approximately how many questions you asked during lecture in your large STEM courses, and at Harvard, of course. And 71% of them say none. And I don't think that's surprising to anyone, right? Because that's just what we observe. But think about it from this point of view, that what we're trying to emulate is one-on-one tutoring, right? With an expert tutor. That's sort of what we're trying to emulate. So imagine that 71% of students, when they have an hour and a half session with an expert tutor, they don't get to ask a single question, right? That would be insane, right? But that's the state of affair. So when students were asked, why do you ask questions or don't ask questions? It was fairly obvious what they answered, but it's still nice to see that they're fearful and shy. They don't want to slow down the pace. They're too confused to formulate questions during lecture. They prefer to wait after. And then, of course, many of them say when the class is smaller, I'm more likely to ask a question, of course. So this is what we did. So during lecture, say midway during the lecture, students are prompted to go on a online portal, and they're being asked to just submit questions that they have about the content that they just learned. So students enter 1, 2, 3 questions, whatever, right? And then we use GPT to summarize all these questions in real time and to give them the summary. Students loved it. So here's the timeline. Students submit their questions through a custom-built online platform. The query is sent to GPT, and then the output is displayed on the big screen, and students are asked to vote on the output. So that's something I'll try to touch on today because it's important. That's one level of human in the loop, which is absolutely required when you use a large language model, right, in an educational environment. It's like a filtering mechanism that here happen automatically. And then the voting is displayed. And then the instructor chooses what to address. That's another level of sort of authoritative, source of information, if you will, of filtering. Yeah. So let me show you what it looked like. So that's an example of, that's the course I was teaching. So we did that in 2 courses throughout the semester. Yeah, so this is a list of themes that came up, and I've asked through the prompt to list 2 representative questions for each themes. So you give students a little bit of time to digest that, and then you tell them to vote on what they like, right? So that's the vote. So for that class, I guess it was fairly flat, their preferences. So the highlights from student interviews. Here's one that came up a lot, and I did not see that coming at all. It was not on my radar. So they said it helps with their confidence. So, and of course, I couldn't wait to ask, well, what the heck do you mean? And for example, one student said, I'm not, wait, I can't see what's on my screen here. I realize that I'm not the only one who's confused and struggling. It lowers my anxiety, right? It kind of makes sense when you read it. I should have thought of that. So obviously, they feel like they learn a lot. Sure. It's an opportunity for them to participate. And that was very important for some of them, many of them, where they never participate in class. They would never dream of raising their hands. So it's nice to see what the whole class is thinking. A lot of them care about that. And then that one actually came up a lot. And that's another thing I didn't quite know. So a sense of control over what I or the other instructor covered. So, when we just answer random questions, students feel like, oh man, this is, what's being talked about right now is not that useful to me, right? Whereas now students feel like during this period where we address these things, they feel like, wow, now the instructors are actually addressing things that I value. So big question is, how does the human compare to the AI, right? The gold standard for that exercise is someone like me taking about 2 hours or so after class and looking at all the submitted questions and try to arrange them into themes and try to come up with representative questions. It requires me to reread over and over and over and rewrite the student questions. It's extremely tedious. It's awful, right? So the question is, the question. This is the gold standard, though, what I, as the instructor, can come up with. So the question is, how accurate is the AI as compared to the gold standard? So first, we evaluated the themes, right? So, and that was fairly easy, by the way. You look at the title for that theme, and between what the AI thinks is a theme and the human thinks is a theme, and that was pretty obvious, even though the language was always different. Oh, those are addressing the same thing, those are not. So it was about 80% overlap between the two. So that's pretty good, but there's a star there. And you see it was about, and that was frustrating in retrospect, it was about a third when it came to GPT-3. And then we had to do lots of prompt engineering to try to increase the percentage and so forth. It was, in retrospect, it was awful. And then representative questions. So what we did is presented lists of these representative questions to experts, and we ask experts, can you tell which one is which one is AI versus human? And of course, the ones, for example, produced by me, I'm certainly not a large language model. I can barely speak English. I'm joking. The ones generated by me, of course, the grammar is not quite right. So we would filter them, just the grammar, right, using GPT. So there's no bias. And most of the time, experts couldn't tell which one is which. So that's somewhat comforting. Now, uh, what about the perceived usefulness of these things, right? From the point of view of students, that's what matters in the end. So in structured interviews, 15 students found the list of AI and human-generated summaries to be equally helpful. For the most part, they felt that way when they were presented with both sets. Now, the next thing here may sound similar, but it's not. It's completely different. So I'll try to articulate that properly. So for 4 lectures, not all 9, for 4, we kept track of all student questions during the lecture, right? Maybe I'll refer to those as maybe random, I don't know, the questions during lecture, right? So we had about 78 of them, if I recall. And then, of course, you have the representative questions, during lecture that the AI would come up with. So when we would present this to students, we would ask them for each question, either human or the AI generated ones. We'd ask, what was the survey question? Because these were carefully worded. It was about the instructor. Oh yeah, them wanting the instructor to answer this particular question. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. And it turns out that students preferred to have the instructor answer the representative questions far more than the random questions during lecture. And just to keep things reasonable, we removed all the questions during lecture that, are terminology based or something like this, right? We removed this. So we just kept the ones that are a bit more meaningful. And this is not too surprising, to be honest. When you look at the representative questions, they typically address something, more meaningful because it's the whole class's thinking. Whereas, like when you answer student questions in class, sometimes you know that, oh, that's probably only valuable to that student and another few more students because peculiarity of that student, right? That student's very advanced or whatever, right? Whereas the representative questions don't suffer from that. So let's see here. Yeah, the strength and weaknesses. So obviously, state of the art, GPT-4 for now, right? Obviously, the strength is that it's fast, it's quick, but we always have to make sure we have a human in the loop, so to speak, so that we can have authoritative sort of knowledge as a guardrail. And what I like to tell people as a guide as to what applications to have in education is to keep track of is to keep track of the complexity of student thinking over time. Like, for example, when students learn about, say, Gauss's law in an intro E&M course, right, the complexity of their thinking is very low before the class during the pre-reading. It gets higher throughout lecture and much higher during the homework and so forth. So these large language models that don't have a good internal model of the world, right, and they don't understand context that well, are going to be much better at providing information at the beginning of what I refer to as a learning cycle, when the sophistication of student thinking is lower. That's why in lecture, you can do this, right? You can get some really good stuff in lecture. But at the end of a homework, let's say, where the sophistication of the thinking is much higher, I've tested this, and it's a bit more difficult. So anyway, here I just said, obviously, GPT-4 accepted much larger prompts. So the prompt engineering allowed us to do a lot more. So again, in retrospect, GPT-3 was absolutely frustrating, even though we did that most of the semester, because only at the end in April, we had access to the GPT-4 API. So the experience for students was still good before, but it became really good at the end of the semester with GPT-4. And now with the new Wolfram Alpha plugin, I mean, it's a whole different ballgame now at least for courses with a lot of equations. So what's next? Of course, deploying that in more courses. And I would love to do that in the larger enrollment courses. So anyone at MIT who's interested to do that, just contact me, and I'll be more than happy to come over and show you how to do that. And the next thing that I've been working on now, and looks like it's going to work, is in this exercise during lecture, is to have the AI come up with concept questions that are directly related to the questions they just asked. And again, because it's during lecture, where the sophistication of their thinking is not yet too high, the success rate is pretty good. So you ask the language model to come up with 3 versions or something, and while students are taking time to vote, you can actually look at the 3 versions in real time and select the one that you like most, and then that's what they get to see. So it's almost like tailor-made clicker questions in real time. So that I'm excited to do. Having said that, I want to thank 2 absolutely wonderful students, Inko and Daria, and then of course Carlos at Harvard. I just want to tell you, the first time that Carlos did that in his course, which was E&M for physics majors, I mean, Carlos was giggling because it's really strange. It feels weird to just see on the screen all of a sudden what everyone is thinking. So yeah, so that's it.
Thank you.